Dear friends, welcome to our channel A3 Stories. Please like, share and subscribe. An A3 Stories original, a love story, Bound by Destiny by Shelly M. Overview. For the sake of my nephew, I will give you my name. Alayan Shah had considered his nephew's needs paramount in comparison to his desire for living a commitment-free life. But now, he was going into lifelong commitment with Sahira, sister-in-law of Alayan's brother, who was no more. Would this be marriage in name only, or would he accept Sahira as his wife? Happy reading. Signing off. Chapter 1. Sahira stood still with her eyes filled with tears and running down her face. It had been a nightmare of a night which she had borne alone, stressed and exhausted with all the waiting. Outside the operation theater, the doctor had come out and gave her the devastating news that they couldn't save her sister. They barely managed to save her son though. The nurse brought her nephew, wrapped in a warm cloth to keep him warm, and gave it to Sahira. Her heart was bleeding as she held the baby in her arms, and exhaustion was seeping into her soul. She was numb with pain, and she cried silently for her nephew as he didn't know the incredible losses he suffered. Both of his parents were taken away from him before he could feel their love. How much they had waited for their child to be born. She looked back numbly at the nurse. Her face showed deep grief, and the nurse's smile had vanished. Feeling for the girl who had waited best part of the night in the hospital all alone. She had rushed into the hospital with her unconscious sister, who was expecting a child but had gone into premature labor. She recalled that her sister was waiting for her husband to return from an outdoor trip for official work. They were watching the TV when they heard on the bulletin that there was a plane crash in the evening. It was the same flight in which her husband was returning from. All passengers were reported dead. Her sister had paled and in shock as the news was confirmed by the newscaster. Sahira had rushed to her sister when she had clutched Sahira's hand in one and the other clutched her tummy. Her sister's eyes were terrified, and she doubled in pain. Sahira, help! Help me! Sahira didn't know what to do. She ran outside barefoot to seek help from her neighbor. The teenage boy had helped her with finding a cab, and both had helped her sister into the cab. She asked the boy to look after their house. All the while her attention was locked at her sister. She didn't know how long it was before they reached the nearby hospital. It was in the suburbs. Once at the hospital, her sister was wheeled into the emergency and from there to the operation theater. After many hours of waiting and praying, all she had left in this world was her nephew. She looked at him held in her arms. He was a beautiful, healthy child with dark hair. She couldn't see his eyes as he was busy crying. His wailing had snapped her out of the numbed state. She moved towards the cold benches lining the corridor. She held him close to comfort him, and soon he had calmed. Was the shock of losing her husband so much that her sister had lost the will to live for her child. Her sister had been 24, a beautiful woman with a heart of gold, and was an adorable wife to her husband. Their marriage of 2 years had brought happiness into their life. Now they were both gone, leaving their child an orphan. Helplessness consumed Sahira, and she didn't know how to overcome it. Miss Noor? Someone called her, and she looked up at the sound. That cultured drawl was icy. She shook her head in acknowledgement. He stood several feet away. A handsome man dressed in a navy-colored Eastern suit and a beige shawl draped across his shoulders. He didn't seem to belong in the humble surrounding of this charity hospital. He was tall, and when he moved closer to her, she had to tilt her head back to look at him. In her numb state, she couldn't figure out that he was 5'11". His clothes and accessories shrieked of his wealth. He had the aura of a daunting man with inborn authority, commanding attention. Sahira plainly stared at the stranger. Please accept my condolences on your sister's death. I was informed at the reception some time ago and it's very unfortunate, he offered tensely. Sahira didn't know who he was and how did he know his sister? Did you know my sister, and how did you find out that we are in this hospital? She asked him, perplexed. I was informed about Asher's plane crash through my security team manager after I returned from my traveling late last night and had your address traced. Your neighbor informed me that he had arranged a cab for you both, but he wasn't aware of the nearby hospital's name, so it took me some time to reach here. Please accept my apologies for the delay. I wish I could have reached earlier, he explained to her. Why did you come looking for us? Did you know Asher? Sahira was perplexed. I am Asher's cousin. Asher's father and mine are brothers. Alayan Shah watched her with expressionless eyes. I have already informed them of your sister's death. They are most distraught at the unfortunate loss of Asher and his wife so close to each other, he specified. Sahira didn't say a word, just silently looked away from him. She cuddled him closer unknowingly, trying to keep him warm as it was chilly during the night. All her attention was immersed on her nephew. She was wearing a thin veil wrapped around her. She took it off from her head with one hand and tried to wrap one half of it around the child while holding her nephew in her lap, securing him by both arms. Alayan Shah silently observed her, and his mouth had thinned. He looked behind him and gestured his security supervisor and other guards to turn around as Sahira was partially covered in her veil, which wasn't sufficient protection for her. He had noticed she was too disturbed to acknowledge her actions. Alayan Shah had withdrew his shawl draped around him and walked towards Sahira. Without giving it another thought, he draped her in it, covering her completely. Sahira was so engrossed in her nephew that she didn't see him approach her. She lifted shocked eyes towards him, transfixed at his action. Give him to me. I would like to meet my nephew. Alayan Shah ignored her silent query and stated with utmost calm. Sahira stood up and handed him the baby. As a result, her veil pulled too, as half of it was wrapped securely around the child. In order to hold on to her veil, she was pulled towards Alayan Shah as he shifted the baby to his shoulder. Sahira halted in shock at the physical closeness. She was small in stature and barely reached his chest. She stiffened with a sudden rush of embarrassment and her face colored self-consciously. She saw his hand pull the edges of his shawl over her shoulder, covering her completely. Let's go, Miss Noor. The formalities are taken care of. My supervisor and his wife will come with your sister in the ambulance. She looked at him for a split second and collided with him, looking at her, expecting her to obey his command. She nodded and forced herself to slowly follow him out of the hospital. His guards were preceding Aliyan and Sahira. They stood guarding them close by while Aliyan settled Sahira in the vehicle. First bending closer to her, he placed the baby in her arms. He went and he sat from the other side of the vehicle. When the door had closed in on them, locking them both in the privacy of the vehicle, the interior was so luxurious, but nothing was registered by Sahira. She was so deep in shock that she didn't even know where they were heading to. Neither did she had the presence of mind to ask him. Her sister Mahira was gone forever. She had just lost her only surviving relation, and the harsh reality was sinking into her soul bit by bit. Their mother had died due to low diabetes when Sahira was 11, and her sister, Mahira, had taken care of her all by herself, just being 18 herself. She was good at stitching clothes and had ensured she had worked day and night to fulfill her younger sister's needs. Look after each other. Their mother had always asked them to do so repeatedly when she was alive. Their mother had been worrying about her children when she had died. Mahira had completed her high school, and it was during the holidays that their mother had suddenly died. Mahira had not given up and focused on providing for her sister and herself without taking anyone's assistance. She had persuaded her neighbor's widowed elderly sister who didn't have any children of her own to come and live with them in their small house in humble suburb situated on the outskirts of cosmopolitan city of Karachi. With Aunt Ruby living with them, they had someone elderly in their household to provide them with much needed protection, that they were not alone anymore. Mahira had been grateful to the elderly aunt for her generosity in coming to live with them. Mahira had worked incessantly, never giving up on her ambition of higher studies for herself. She had done her best to give Sahira the love and care that she needed, while Aunt Ruby had taken care of both of them like her own children. In essence, she was a loving woman and considered them as her family. They had a secure life, if not very comfortable. They were always grateful for what they had rather than what wasn't available to them. It hadn't been easy for Mahira to work by the day and privately study at night, as her sister's welfare and needs were of prime importance to her. Mahira had managed it well when Sahira had passed her 10th standard when she was 16 years old. Sahira had learned to help her sister out with her boutique orders and was awaiting her admissions in high school. Mahira was happy to see her younger sister grow into a sensible and responsible person. She couldn't thank her lucky stars in seeing the outcome of her hard work. At the wedding ceremony of the boutique owner's daughter, Mahira had met Asher Shah, and that was the moment when Asher decided that she would be his wife. Looking at her simplicity, he had entered her sister's life knowing all her background. She was a beautiful woman and loved her relations. Without holding back, he appreciated her and had approached Mahira for marriage through his aunt, who was the boutique owner, and Mahira had respected the lady highly. Sahira was very excited and happy for her sister, as she deserved all the happiness in the world. Asher and Mahira had married within weeks, and he had purchased a new house where he had taken Mahira and Sahira along, whereas Aunt Ruby had returned to her family, seeing now they had someone to look after them. They were grateful to Aunt Ruby for all she had done for them and promised to stay in touch in future. Asher had proved to be a wonderful husband to Mahira and a caring elder brother to Sahira. Sahira respected him. He was a man of honor and had fulfilled his promise to Aunt Ruby that he will take care of them. Mahira had grown to love and respect her husband. Time seemed to have flown by, and finally they were welcoming the much-awaited child into this world when Asher had to travel for his official work for a few days. He was anxious to leave Mahira behind in her delicate condition and had said so, but was helpless in delaying the visit, which was crucial to the business where he was employed. Mahira had calmed him down and said she would wait for him, and he should not fret for them. Asher had left his wife and unborn child with a heavy heart, and before leaving, told Sahira to take care of her sister, and should there be any need she should call him right away, and not to listen to Mahira even if stops her. She promised him that she would do so. He had hugged her sister before leaving, and Mahira felt shy in front of her younger sister, and Sahira self-consciously looked away. Asher had left, never to return. With the news of plane crash in which Asher was returning, her sister Mahira had given up for the first time and followed her husband in death, leaving her son behind in Sahira's care. Sahira was so lost in her reverie that she was brought back to the present with a jolt when the baby in her arms started crying. She was appalled at her forgetfulness. She was so lost that she had forgotten her surroundings, the baby in her arms, and when she heard Alian speak beside her calmly, "Let me carry him, you must be tired," he saw silent tears falling on her face without her realizing it. Alian knew the young girl had been dealt with blows by nature, and it would be some time before she could recover. Now she was worried for the child that her sister had left in her care. How would she take care of the small child all by herself? She looked at the child and back at Elian, and refused him silently with the movement of her head. She held the child against her chest, trying to dispel the dread that had engulfed her completely. Elian could see her emotions running riot within the young girl. It was just proving too much for her to handle. He took the decision in his hand and, covering the space between them, moved closer towards her before silently pulling her from behind her shoulders with one of his arms towards himself. Sahira wasn't prepared for it and landed against his side without a modicum of resistance. He hugged her to his side and relieved her of the child with another arm. "Let me decide for you both for now, as you are too distraught," he said in a calming voice, and Sahira felt as if he sounded like brother-in-law, Asher, who had always cared for her with brotherly concern. "Brother Asher, Mahira left us." Sahira had confused Elian as her brother-in-law in her muddled state of mind and wept, leaning into Elian's shoulder, her slight frame shaking with muffled sobs while Elian had been frozen to the spot. He had never been confused for someone else in his life before. He had maintained a small distance between them when he had pulled Sahira to comfort her in her shaken state. However, Sahira, in her grief, had leaned into him, calling him with some other person's identity. Elian held the back of her head and lifted it towards his face with a jerk, shocking her into immobility and speaking in an icy tone. "I am not your brother Asher, and it's better if you keep some distance for the sake of the driver and guards, as they would not understand your grief, would think of you to be a woman with no inhibitions. Do you want to drag your reputation and mine into a compromising situation?" Elian questioned her without mincing words, jolting her out of the muddled state of mind that she was in, resulting in confusing him for her brother-in-law. How could he be Asher, as he was dead and would not be coming back? She explained it to herself. Her eyes were haunted and were captured by Elian's. His breath was warm on her face, and with the little distance there was, she was afraid to breathe, even fearing she might anger him more with her actions. She veiled her pained eyes with thick lashes and barely nodded her head in agreement. Her tears had ceased to fall, and she waited for him to release her. With her heart beating against her ribcage due to fear, even her tears had stopped. Elian had forgotten why he was angry anymore and was lost for a moment at the picture she presented this close to him. Her eyes were veiled from him by her eyelids having beautiful, long, and thick lashes. Her cheeks were wet with the tears, her mouth slightly open. It was so easy to read her face. She was like an open book to him. With her head tilted backwards, as he held the back of her head with one palm, her neck was exposed to him. He diverted his downward glance as the shawl he had covered her with was thick and didn't stay in one place and had parted from the center in all the movement. He spoke quietly in the thick atmosphere. "Cover up yourself, Miss Noor. It is not right for others to see you in such a state, or they will think you to be too free-spirited." He had carefully veiled his words, and she lifted. Elian was sure what he said next will be plain enough for her to understand and leave her embarrassed simultaneously. "With you throwing yourself at me, others would think I accepted your favors within the confines of this vehicle, with the partition closed between the driver and guard sitting at the front and we at the back of this luxurious vehicle. In a few minutes we would be reaching our home, and the entire family would have gathered to receive us. With your disheveled appearance, everyone would come to know what had transpired between us. So, it's best if you compose yourself and cover yourself up well, and what with everything that has happened less than a few hours ago, I don't want to land yourself in more trouble than there already is." He locked his gaze with hers, and she couldn't look away from him. It seemed she was lost in him. She couldn't make out anything he said, just saw his lips moving so close to her. Nothing made sense to her. He silently observed her, waiting for her to react at the insult he had just inflicted on her. intentionally to draw her out of her shock and divert her mind from the numbing pain of losing her family a few hours ago. Alian pulled Sahira a tad bit closer to him, sliding his hand from the back of her head to slide between her thick hair to land at the back of her neck, and the distance between their faces had reduced. Sahira was dazed and frozen to the spot. It was the first time she was in such proximity to a man, and if that man was as dazzling like Alian Shah, then someone like Sahira had no opportunity of keeping her faculties in present state of mind. The warmth from Alian's palm and his touch was so alien to Sahira that her throat was closed. She could barely swallow. Alian was watching the emotions running on her expressive face with ease. He could decipher that Sahira was in a daze, and had she been in her full senses she would have backed out and maintained her distance from him. "Sahira, are you listening to me?" he asked her in a quiet tone, shifting the dozing baby slightly in his arms to place him against his other shoulder. With no response forthcoming from Sahira, he slightly shook her, moving his hand towards her shoulder, and she came to her senses. Jerking away from him, she turned her gaze towards herself and was ashamed to see the shawl had parted from the center, partially uncovering her. She self-consciously quickly covered herself and moved toward the farthest end of the seat. She shrouded herself completely in the shawl, and Alian was constantly watching her every move. My family functions based on a strict code of conduct. They have old mindsets and rules to adhere to. Sarah heard him speak in a controlled tone. My father is the eldest in the family, and he is the decision maker, so to speak. Everyone adheres to his decision happily without a question. Then comes Asher's father, who has been dead before Asher's marriage to your sister. His mother is alive though. Then it's the widow sister of my father, who had a daughter betrothed to Asher, living in the same house as us. They were married as per arrangement, but after Asher met your sister, he refused to stay married to his wife. He divorced her, thus committing a sin no one in the family was ready to forgive. After he expressed his wish to marry your sister and divorcing his wife, he was expelled from the household and was asked never to return. He accepted the punishment and left to be with your sister 2 years ago, never returning once, severing all ties with us. Sahira was shocked to hear the background of Asher, who for the sake of his love and commitment to his sister had left his family, and what was worst was that he had divorced his first wife for the sake of his sister. Sahira didn't know what was more devastating to find: Asher being married to someone else before he had married her sister, or divorcing his first wife to marry her sister. Alian continued, "Few days ago Asher had called me to share the news with me that he was about to be a father, and that he wanted me to ensure that his family was looked after in his absence, as he was at the airport boarding a flight. I asked him why all of a sudden had he called me out of the blue, and he responded that if he trusted anyone in this world, then it was me. Despite whatever happened in the past, he was regretful of it all and had wished he was not married forcefully to his cousin, who had liked my younger brother, and was afraid of voicing it out for fear of my father and her widowed mother. He didn't push his wife to accept him as her husband. Instead, he took the blame on himself and released her from the marriage in which she wasn't happy at all." Sahira was surprised to hear the second side of the story. It shed light on her brother-in-law from a different angle. This was the side she was used to seeing, the kind and generous side, i.e. Alian carried on. "When Asher divorced and left his wife, my father felt he had failed his widowed sister and wanted to make it up to her, so he offered the proposal of his second son for his niece. My father's decision was accepted, and after 6 months they were married and have been happy together ever since. Since I am the eldest born, hence I have taken over as the head of the Shah Industries and considered the big wheel in Shah family. My decisions are respected by everyone. That's why my desire to avoid arranged marriages has been given importance. Faint color had darkened Alian's features while he casted a look at Sahira sitting huddled at the further end of the seat. He added, since my cousin has made me responsible for his family's welfare, therefore I have decided to accept the responsibility of his son as my own and raise him as my own son. While you as his wife's sister he treated you no less than a sister, I will accept your responsibility as well, and you will have the protection of my name and raise your sister and brother-in-law's child as our own. He stated this with such authority that Sahira was left dumbfounded by it all. She was looking at him with amazement and couldn't articulate a response. When she did find her voice, Alian heard her stutter, you mean, and her voice disappeared. While Alian Shah hid a smile at her reaction and stated plainly for her to understand, I meant you and I are getting married since you are not a child that I can adopt easily but a young woman whom I can't give protection until you are married to me. That way no one will raise an objection for me coming to see you while you raise the baby. So, this is the best solution there is in the circumstances while I fulfill the promise I made to my cousin, although it's up to you whether you want to be around the baby to ensure that he has the love and care of two parents who would be there for him and will nurture and protect his interests above their own. However, if you do not wish to be his mother, then as my wife some other woman will take care of him. But whether she will be sincere in caring for him and loving him will not be guaranteed. He left the ball in her court to decide without any pressure. Whatever Sahira's decision would be, Alian would accept it without a question, but he knew that her decision would be in their favor. The baby is a Shah, and he needs to be where his roots are, and he will be well provided for with me. Greek, Alian reminded her as a matter of fact. If you really love him, Sahira, you will agree to my. But I don't know you at all. How can I get married to you? She asked incredulously. His features softened hearing her only objection was that they were strangers to each other. That can be remedied easily. I'll tell you all there is to know about me and my background. I and your brother-in-law, we share the same grandfather, and our fathers are brothers. We have a joint family system, and my father is the eldest in the family. As his first born, I have taken over as the head of the family, and I am now responsible for the entire family. We own agriculture lands for generations, and that was the only means of our vast wealth, but now I have ventured into other businesses. Sahira heard him dumbly. Didn't Asher ever mention to you or your sister about us that I own a freight forwarding business, 5-star hotels in the Middle East, Europe and Mediterranean islands? Sahira had been dumbfounded hearing him. She genuinely had no idea that her sister's husband from a wealthy background, Asher, had been so humble and down to earth, whereas his cousin was so full of himself. Well, hadn't she asked for it? With her sister and brother-in-law gone, she was left alone to decide the fate for their young child, and she was responsible for providing whatever was necessary and essential for ensuring that he had a secured life with two parents to love him. Sahira raised anguished eyes to meet Alian's. He could easily see her trembling hands, and her face couldn't hide the anguish that was inside her. She could not imagine life without her sister. Miss Noor. Sahira nodded her head in agreement and didn't look at Alian. Is that a yes to my proposal, Miss Noor? He asked her flatly so there was no confusion. Please Almighty, let my decision be in the best interest for my nephew and me, she prayed feverishly, clasping her trembling hand around her middle before responding to him shakily. Yes, for the sake of my nephew I agree, as I know he belongs to your family as you both share the same background, but I want to be part of his life to ensure that he is loved and well taken care of, just as my sister took care of me. Alian heard her response and was amazed at her commitment towards her sister and her child. That was loyalty, and he liked her honest response, but for the first time he had been placed second to best, as the prime reason for her agreement was not him but his nephew, whom she wanted to raise herself, and that could only be possible if she was around as his wife. That was a bitter pill to swallow. Nonetheless, he had her agreement, and that was of paramount importance to him for now. He clenched his teeth, and she was hardly aware of his suppressed rage. I will leave you with my family, and I hope you will quietly agree to whatever I say to them, which is necessary to establish your place in my life. That will surely grant you the importance once your position as my wife is defined to them. I hope you will understand that I can't leave you and my nephew alone in your house unattended while I see to the funeral arrangements. Sahira had visibly paled as she heard the word funeral arrangements. A sense of helplessness, panic claimed her. No, no, please don't bury her. She is the only family I have left. I do not intend to delay the burial of both. So please, Sahira, accept the facts that your sister and her husband are both gone and not returning, so you and I are now responsible for their son in the circumstances. Then take us with you, please. I don't know your family, and I want to be around for the last rituals for the people I loved the most. Sahira pleaded with him, covering the distance between them. She held his arm, in which he was carrying the now sleeping baby. His eyes, set between incredibly luxuriant, jet black lashes, were blazing at her. She had to tilt her chin back to look at him, as he was much taller than her. Get a grip on yourself, girl. I am not leaving among the jungle lions to make a meal out of you, but to foresee arrangements after I explain about you to my family first. But with you throwing yourself at me like this, I am sure I do not have to explain anything to them, since they are watching us now and will figure it out themselves that the woman who has thrown caution to the winds and in front of their eyes is plastered to their son won't just be just anyone but my woman. And since we do not go for illegal liaisons with women, you could only be my wife. He launched at her with blazing undertone, his classic bone structure starkly prominent with rigid fury and frustration. I am sorry, I just think, Sahira murmured shakily. His intense gaze had narrowed over her very small, very slight figure and the huge, pained eyes dominating her round face. Let's go inside before my family watching us from the windows will draw conclusions of their own about us. Let me save both of us the embarrassment by explaining to them that we have married a few weeks ago, and since your family is no more, therefore, I have brought you home with me. I do not desire to offer them with every detail of our marriage of convenience to them. That remains only between you and me, and later after the funeral I will get married to you without involving anyone. So, for now, just be quiet while I offer them the details, including my liking towards you, and my desire to own you was such that I couldn't delay for my family to come around and then approach your family for your marriage. By doing so, your importance and your position will be established firmly beside me in front of my family. Your quiet acquiescence will be of great assistance to me at such trying times for both of us. Sahira was shocked at his words and took a step back from him while he held her hand and strode towards the house. They had gone inside the house, and he had introduced her as his wife to them. There were different degrees of shock, and suddenly she couldn't face their anger and disgust. She hid behind Alian and held onto his shirt in both of her hands. Alian stiffened visibly in her closeness. In front of his family had sealed his relationship with her at her familiarity with him. Color ran across his cheeks, while the elders, coming from the old school of thoughts who didn't appreciate any form of physical closeness to be shown by the younger generation openly in front of the elders, out of sheer respect for them. He was being grilled by their blazing rage, unbeknown to Sahira, who was afraid by so many strange faces looking at her when Alian had introduced her as his wife. His elderly aunt thought that the girl was shy and was hiding behind Alian. She came close to them, and taking the child from his arms calmly told him to take his wife and child to his room while they waited for him. Alian was frozen to hear his aunt refer to the child as his own, while she gave the child to Sahira to carry in her arms. Sahira, completely covered in Alian's shawls, was visibly in shock after listening to the elderly lady's assumption of considering the baby as her and Alian's child. The elderly lady petted her head and asked her to see to the baby's needs first. Go and see to our grandchild first, and we will meet both of you after you have rested. I will have some food sent to your bedroom, she kindly said to her. She nodded her head silently in agreement and asked the house helper to show her to Alian's bedroom. Alian had turned to them and intervened. I will take them myself, aunt, that's very kind of you. She smiled at him in understanding. I will have the food arranged for both of you in your bedroom in a few minutes. Go freshen up, son, it looks like you both had a long night. He held her from her shoulder, draping his arm around her, while she stiffened at the unexpected physical touch, and she looked at him with incredulity in her eyes. He started moving, looking straight ahead, so she was forced to move with him quickly as he was much taller than her and his steps were bigger than hers. She had to practically run to keep up with him. Once inside the opulent bedroom suite, which was so big and so extravagant that she had never seen anything remotely close, even on the television, he guided her onto the bed covered in rich blue silk covers and dark furniture. She was scared to place the child on the expensive sheets. Looking at her indecision and her unwillingness to part from the child, Alian stepped forward and bent towards her. With sudden reflexes, she inclined backwards and away from him due to his closeness while he took the baby from her and placed him on the bed. He moved back and silently stood up from the bed, looking down at her while she couldn't drag her eyes away from him. Her head was tilted back and her neck was exposed to him, while the shawl had slightly dislodged from around her face and exposing her unblemished neck and her demure neckline. He gritted his teeth and looked away from her, and she felt hurt, as if he just couldn't push himself to see her any longer than was absolutely necessary. She hadn't forgotten what he insultingly said to her before entering the house, that she was throwing herself at him with all his family to see for themselves. Well, she didn't ask him to come into her life in the first place, followed by all his actions were based solely on his decision, and she had no intention of embarrassing him or herself in front of anyone. It was just that she had lost her sister and her only relative that she was being so unlike her shy and reserved self. I will send the maid to you while you freshen up. I will ask my brother's wife to send you some clothes so that you can change. I have asked all necessary supplies to be arranged from outside for the baby. It must be arriving soon. Tell me if you want anything to be arranged for you, he asked her, not quiet looking at her but at the sleeping child. He must be hungry. Wake him up and feed him a bottle soon. I'll just check where the supplies are now. He fetched his cell phone and connected with someone while moving out of her hearing range. She silently watched him and felt helpless tears trickle down her cheeks while all the delayed shock was closing in on her. The tears came in a silent tidal wave, streaming down her quivering cheeks in agonized relief. She didn't think that if he turned around, he would see her in this terrible state in front of him. Alian towered over her, casting a shadow, and she smelt his perfume this close and felt his presence. She hunched some more. Heard her say between sobs, I didn't invite you into our lives. You came looking for us, and now you are making me feel that we are not welcome in your life and your house. Powerful hands suddenly clasped her wrists to remove them from her face. His gesture shook her, and unconsciously she backed away out of his reach, while he pulled her to her feet to stand close to him. Now you will stop this crying and listen to me, he announced. He understood her pain. After all, she was very young and too many blows have been dealt to her in last couple of hours. He said to her while she looked at him, craning her neck backwards, "You know that your sister and your brother-in-law are gone," he said with a harsh finality. She clashed with hard, dark eyes, and they unsettled her. "Now we are both responsible for their son together and give him the life which his parents had thought to give him, had they been alive." Sahira was frozen to the spot. Her thick lashes trembled as she simply stared at Aliyan in a daze. Reading her astonishment, he smiled. He smiled. "Naturally, as Asher's last wishes, I am to look after you both. Naturally, I can only achieve that by marrying you, and I will raise his child as my own son. If that troubles you, then it would be best for all of us that you accepted the fact quickly, and since everyone is under the impression that he is our son, then it would be in the best interest for him that we keep them believing that." Chapter 2. Sahira was shocked at his suggestion to accept that her sister's child was his and Sahira's. It was too overwhelming for her to even absorb and make any sense of it. Aliyan took her silence as acceptance. He studied her closely. "As my firstborn son, Azan will be adored by my entire clan and would be greatly cherished. Your son? Your family never forgave your brother for marrying my sister, and now you want to claim their baby as your own?" Her voice was shaken. "Whatever has happened can't be undone, neither can we turn back the clock. As your sister's child, you owe it to your sister to provide whatever is best for her son's future." Aliyan told her sternly. "You need to decide now. Going forward, I will not allow you to retreat. Once you accept that he is our son and will be promised a life filled with love and nurturing from both his parents that he will know are his own, as I do not want to rock his life by the harsh realities." He further elaborated to her, leaving no room for any doubts. His devotion to his late cousin was evident. "I agree," she whispered. "After the funeral, we will get married. Legally," Aliyan Shah murmured softly, sealing her fate with him. Sahira slightly nodded her head in acknowledgement. Aliyan asked her, his gaze intent on her, trying to determine, "What age are you? 20? Enthralled, Sahira gazed back at him, her hands trembling while he held them in his. At least he had something wrong, otherwise she thought he would know everything perfectly. "As my wife, you will have to work on yourself. You need to have some class, with the right clothes, jewelry." Aliyan keenly observed her. "I will hire professional trained staff for your makeover." 18. "I am 18 years old," Sahira whispered to him. She had always been shy and reserved in her high school and college, and had concentrated on her studies than her looks. Her sister had always appreciated her beauty, as she always stated that she didn't need any artificial support to draw attention towards herself. She had a heart of gold, and that what made her shine among her peers. Her excellent grades had outshone her among her class fellows who tended to be more fashion savvy than her. Her cosseted life had ended abruptly, and with her loving sister gone, all her misapprehensions about her looks were being inconsiderately frayed to scraps. Her cheeks warmed as she was embarrassed at his comments for prettying her up for his benefit so that she could match him in his hi-fi society. She shuddered as she breathed in deep. She never wanted to attract any undue attention towards herself from the opposite gender. That's why she always maintained a simple and plain lifestyle. He had thought her too beneath his caliber. She felt utterly humiliated, but she was struggling to conceal from him. He was amazed to see her turn pink with embarrassment as she disclosed her age. God in heaven, but she was very young, way too young for him. Was she misleading him with her age to make him feel guilty for marrying someone so much younger to him? Sahira was conscious of his staring fixedly at her, as if he wanted to read her thoughts and reach into her soul. "I don't want a makeover. I dislike attracting attention from others by dressing myself up in flashy clothes which instead of covering do just the opposite. I prefer to stay the way I have always been, please. She told him, grabbing much-needed courage. Her eyes were veiled by thick, dark, long lashes casting a shadow over her cheeks and managing to draw his attention towards their natural beauty. His facial bones tightened perceptibly, eyes resting on her, without any distinguishable sentiment in them. As my wife, it is expected of you to be perfectly in every aspect. Primarily your dressing sense should be impeccable, as your shabby personality does not match the persona of how my wife should be. In my opinion, you should make more than an effort to please me as it befits my wife, he said too bluntly, and Sahira's cheeks were flaming up at his suggestion for her to garb in fashionable clothes and accessories to grasp his attention. God forbid the visual picture conjured by his words left her shuddering inwardly. Her teeth sank into her lower lip, ensnaring his attention to them. She never saw his hand reaching out to release the tortured lower lip from her teeth. She was shocked at his gesture. It was so unexpected. Sarah was trembling with shame. Would it be so miserable for you to dress up for me as your husband? Is it too much to ask from you as my wife? God, did she really hear him say that? Sahira was tormented by the unbelievable sudden change in Alian Shah. Sahira didn't trust her voice, so all she could do was move her head in negative. A response that had pleased Alian Shah. He wasn't expecting her to be so young, but the way she carried herself, like an old maid, shrieked that she was older than her actual age. Teenage girls these days were much more flamboyant and were more inclined towards trying new things to see what suited them most. Okay, so it was a tough pill for him to accept that she was almost half his age, but for the sake of his nephew he all but willingly accepted her, which would ensure that she is well provided for as his wife and mother to his nephew. No, his son, he corrected himself. The same evening after the funerals, Alian returned to the bedroom where she was reclining against the pillows with the baby in her arms while she fed him milk from a bottle. Without warning, he just walked in. It was about 6 in the evening. Sahira's hair was still damp from the shower she had hastily taken late afternoon while the maid had seen to the baby. She thought she will tie up her hair after putting the baby to sleep. Neither did she bother covering herself with the slippery veil, which tended to slip more rather than stay draped around her. The maid had brought her a few expensive-looking designer suits made of expensive fabrics in jewel colors, and surprisingly they seemed to be untouched. To Sahira they looked as if they were fancy party wear, since she had always preferred classic cuts in plain fabrics. She opted for a saffron-colored single-tone Eastern dress with a short shirt and matching separate culottes of the same material with white embroidery on the shirt front, sleeves, and hemline. The top was slightly form-fitting and wasn't to her liking, but she didn't have an option. The other two dresses were much fancier, would prove to be cumbersome for her to manage with a child to take care of. She discarded them, thinking them to be impractical. She had placed the silky veil beside her pillow as it kept slipping, and got busy with the baby, changing him carefully with the help of the experienced maid. After sponging him and putting on fresh clothes on him, she had enjoyed spending time with her nephew. He was so tiny, but the maid told him he was healthy and that she did a good job by eating well for him to be born healthy. God, how embarrassing it was for her to think she had anything to do with his birth. But she didn't correct the elderly maid, as she was fully aware that Alian Shah would prefer her silence than spill the true facts. It was only sensible to maintain her silence, and she mumbled a thanks to her. After the maid had left, she was trying to put the baby to sleep. He was dozing, and she looked lovingly at him, trying to find any resemblance to her sister. She didn't find any. He was the spitting image of the Shah family. She was recalling that Aliyan had called the baby Azan. She liked the name immensely. Azan Aliyan, it suited the baby in her arms. The bedroom door opened silently and Aliyan Shah walked in. All Aliyan could see was a waterfall of silky dark hair. Covered both of her arms and her back. He couldn't see their length as they were hidden from his sight. He stopped in front and was mesmerized by her. Sahira looked at him. He had a strange, arrested look in his eyes. At first her mind was blank, then she recalled that she was sitting without the veil with her hair all over the place since it was damp, and due to its denseness and length she had opted to let it dry completely before tied it up, otherwise she would have ended up having a headache had she tied them while it was wet. She was embarrassed to see it had attracted his attention. She sat transfixed under his gaze. Her long dark hair had captivated his interest. She looked lovely at the picture she presented with the baby in her arms and the dim light from the lampshade on the bedside was casting a soft glow on her. The saffron pure silk dress did make her look like a golden goddess as she sat there transfixed. Sahira looked different from how he had seen her at the hospital, completely washed out of misery, and she looked dull in her white attire. The soft, silken jewel tone complemented her creamy complexion, which had looked pale earlier. The bath and some nourishing broth followed by dates and dry figs had helped her somehow more than the clothes. She looked different, and it was the missing veil which she kept herself shrouded in. He found that her veil was neatly kept beside her pillow. He picked it up and held it over her head, covering her in the gauzy folds, with baby and all in her arms. She was so embarrassed that she couldn't lift her eyes to see him. What must he be thinking that she had been that way intentionally? She shuddered on the unbidden thought. He greeted her first and she responded in a low voice to not disturb the baby's sleep. You will have to come with me now. He sat beside them and touched the soft cheeks of the nuzzling baby while softly speaking to her. She lifted her eyes then and asked him if she could carry the baby with her in the carry cot. No, the maid will look after him in your absence. We will return in a few hours. Until then she will look after him. She nodded in agreement, and he waited beside them. She was feeling self-conscious with him sitting so close and observing them while the baby's hand was clasped on Sahira's neckline. Aliyan reached to unclasp the baby's hand from her neckline, and Sahira couldn't be more mortified. When she heard a knock at the door and saw Aliyan walk towards the door, she was grateful for the diversion. She didn't see who it was as Aliyan went outside to speak to whoever it was. Sahira couldn't help but appreciate the caring and considerate side of Aliyan Shah, who was so careful about not disturbing the baby's sleep, and he was a highly respectable and decent man with impeccable upbringing. On every occasion since he had met her, he had ensured that her dignity and respect was unscathed. Her eyes had turned watery thinking of how fortunate it was for the baby and her to have been under the protection of such a generous man who had high standards of principles and knew how to keep his promises, especially to his cousin who was no more in this world to hold him accountable had Aliyan chosen not to fulfill his promise made to his late cousin. These were men of integrity and great upbringing whom you could respect easily and would feel fortunate enough to have known them in any capacity. Coming through the door, Aliyan looked at her while she bent over the sleeping baby, placing him in the sleeping bag carefully. She was so engrossed in her task that she didn't see him approach. Dark eyes lingered on her in the muted lamplight. She looked ethereal in the emotion softening her features. His decision to select her as his nephew's mother was proving to be right. She wasn't among the league of women who weren't bothered with what became of their own children. They were so full of themselves that they didn't bother with looking after their own offsprings, let alone someone else's child. Sahira was different. She had this soft side to herself which would be as loving to any child that she came across. When she stood up, she saw him looking at her and her cheeks turned crimson. He pursued towards her, fetched his shawl from the settee and moved to cover her in its folds, leaving her face uncovered. Under her stunned scrutiny, he walked away from her. It was the second time that day that he had covered her with his shawl. I would very much appreciate if you covered yourself up when you are stepping out of this house. There are several guards of mine and I do not wish them watching you at all. I consider it highly disrespectful. Sarah shook her head silently in agreement. Within her nerves were taut with embarrassment. In the course of today's events twice, he had seen her that way and lectured her to be more careful with her attire. Firstly, she was in a shattered state of mind after the death of her sister, followed by the news of the plane crash where her brother-in-law had died. Secondly, she was too occupied with the baby and found the silky material of the veil too much to handle as it was becoming cumbersome. Furthermore, she wasn't expecting him to return tonight to the same bedroom which only had one bed, and knowing him he would not share the same bed under any circumstances while she wasn't married to him legally. My lawyer is waiting for us at my farmhouse. There we will get married, he said to her without any preliminaries. It seemed as if he had read her mind and in response to her fears dredged deep into her soul regarding the fear of unknown. She didn't know where she stood with him, only time could tell. She was thrown at how he could so easily reach into her soul and read her innermost feelings. It seemed all her paths had led her to him. She was deep into her thoughts without realizing. Her throat seemed parched, the tip of her tongue snaked out to moisten her dry lips. He was watching her closely and his eyes flamed spontaneously. His attention was captivated. Faint color suffused his neck all way up to his hairline. His features hardened perceptibly. The air was crackling with tension between them, and it brought her goosebumps on her skin. Suddenly feeling chilled in response, she watched him suddenly smiling fleetingly before it disappeared. Maybe she had just imagined it. She shook herself to move and diffuse the tension around them which had suddenly sprung God know where from. I am a man who honors his promises once I make them. Dark eyes rested on her, referring to his promise made to his cousin before his sudden death. She believed him. He was like an angel sent to them by the God in heaven. She couldn't be more grateful for the Creator's mercies. She nodded to him spontaneously without realizing, smiling, curving her mouth, and her eyes had shone with unshed tears. He was mesmerized by her beauty, where smiled and cried together, but he was perceptive enough to know that the tears were of sheer happiness, one which she couldn't hide from him. They were married at his farmhouse in the presence of his lawyer. His few friends along with their wives were present. The guests had departed after dinner, wishing them well. Congratulations Mr. and Mrs. Alian Shaw on your nuptials. The lawyer had wished them after the religious wedding ceremony was over. One day that child will be grateful to you both for giving him the love and care that he deserved and providing him his rightful place in the family. Sahira had blushed at being called with her new identity, one which joined her to him religiously, and in front of the society they were now husband and wife. Her head was bent, and she was deep in thoughts. Alian had ensured through his actions that, before the day was over, he had banished all the uncertain clouds from her horizon in giving her the protection of his name and presence, all the while determined not to show how big a feat was achieved with so much ease at his end. He had thought, for the sake of his nephew and providing her the care and shelter, this would be an arranged marriage where their lives would be devoid of love, desire, even liking, as there was a chasm between them of many years. He didn't want to force his attentions on a young child in her teens. Alian wanted to be responsible for her welfare rather than be the reason of her distress. She was too young to handle all that marriage had to offer. Sahira's mind was numb, all her thoughts were incoherent, just the presence of Alian registered and his hooded yes looking at her. And his smiling lips which took away many years from his always serious face. Her thoughts were incoherent, and the only thing that made sense to her was the man filling her vision. It was Alian, her husband. Alian turned his head slightly to place his lips against the warmth of her palm and bestowing upon her his first kiss, all the while looking at her, seeing her snap out of her daze. She was jolted back to reality. His firm mouth had rested so softly for the briefest of moments against her palm, and she felt as if she had been marked for life. Marked as his for life would rather be more apartment. The torment carried through her veins and wild color climbed her neck and face, but she didn't step back. That was her trust that this relationship bestowed on her. She could trust to be near him and not feel intimidated. If her mind and her subconscious accepted him as her own, then how could her heart not accept his closeness and would want to withdraw from him? After all, he was hers now. Alian could see the turmoil rioting inside her, but it was expected. In the circumstances, he in his maturity had certainly not been surprised by her reaction. He said to her softly, banking down the fires raging to get out of control inside him and claim her as his. In every sense of the word, let's go home, Sahira. Our son must be sleeping, and I don't want him to feel disoriented upon waking up and not finding us there. I would like to tell you that I am indebted to you for providing our nephew with what he needs most. Security of being loved and cared for by both his parents and providing him and me with your name above. Thank you so much. Sahira couldn't suppress her feelings. Her words were filled with emotions and voice was barely audible to Alian. Had he not been standing so close to Sahira, he wouldn't have been able to decipher what she had said. He smiled faintly and his features had softened, mesmerizing Sahira entirely. How could one look so handsome? And unbeknown to herself, she lifted her free hand and touched the side of his face near his lips to catch the fleeting smile of his. Alian was unprepared, and her spontaneous gesture had caught him unawares, surprising him. Alian was a mature man and realized that Sahira was just a teenage girl in awe of him while he was well into his 30s. She was so caught up in whole of this maze that she couldn't find her head, neither did she realize where her actions would lead to. She was inviting something which she wasn't aware of, neither prepared for. Alian's eyes were unfathomable pools. His smile had vanished, and his cheekbones looked prominent as his face hardened, exercising control on his reaction. Control he must for her sake, as she was too young, and he knew better than to take advantage of her when she herself didn't realize what she had done and was inviting for herself. Looking intently at her, he reached for her hand which rested beside his lips, and she was transfixed and so lost in him that it was bolstering his ego in finding a real treasure who had come to him without any vices and was so pure that he could read what was going on in her mind and her soul. He had thought, for the sake of his nephew and providing her the care and shelter, this would be an arranged marriage where their lives would be devoid of love, desire, even liking, as there was a chasm between them of many years. He didn't want to force his attentions on a young child in her teens. Alian wanted to be responsible for her welfare rather than be the reason of her distress. She was too young to handle all that marriage had to offer. Sahira's mind was numb, all her thoughts were incoherent, just the presence of Alian registered and his hooded yes looking at her. And his smiling lips which took away many years from his always serious face. Her thoughts were incoherent, and the only thing that made sense to her was the man filling her vision. It was Alian, her husband. Alian turned his head slightly to place his lips against the warmth of her palm and bestowing upon her his first kiss, all the while looking at her, seeing her snap out of her daze. She was jolted back to reality. His firm mouth had rested so softly for the briefest of moments against her palm, and she felt as if she had been marked for life. Marked as his for life would rather be more apartment. The torment carried through her veins and wild color climbed her neck and face, but she didn't step back. That was her trust that this relationship bestowed on her. She could trust to be near him and not feel intimidated. If her mind and her subconscious accepted him as her own, then how could her heart not accept his closeness and would want to withdraw from him? After all, he was hers now. Alian could see the turmoil rioting inside her, but it was expected. In the circumstances, he in his maturity had certainly not been surprised by her reaction. He said to her softly, banking down the fires raging to get out of control inside him and claim her as was his in every sense of the word. "Let's go home, Sahira. Our son must be sleeping, and I don't want him to feel disoriented upon waking up and not finding us there." He knew that the child was barely a day old and would not be missing either of them, but he tried to diffuse the tension between them, which was so thick that one could easily cut into it. She nodded, disoriented, and smiled to him. "You appear to have lost your voice after our wedding. It seems, or you are not very happy about it, that you don't want to communicate with me?" He teased her softly. She was surprised to encounter this facade of Alian. It was so different from what she had seen earlier today. His serious side, when he was angry at her, it seemed to her that he might have been carved from stone with no warm blood running through his heart. His fierce pride would force him to say things to her which she had not done intentionally. She had even experienced his caring side to him, when he arranged everything that was imperative for the baby, within a short span of time. The baby had not wanted for anything. It seemed Alian had prepared for his arrival for many weeks, executed to perfection, all in a few hours. Then his honorable side, which she most admired him for. He didn't let the day pass by without getting married to her and ensuring she had the respectability and rightful name of his for him to occupy the same room as her and the baby. He had a conscientious soul, one which deeply earned respect from his new wife. In the vehicle while returning to their home, Alian Alex commented with a curiously slumbrous look in his dark eyes as they rested on her shimmering profile, dressed in finest of clothes and expensive pieces of jewelry to mark the auspicious occasion of their marriage. In a way, he was delighted to have made it special for her, on top of all the misery she had had to go through alone. It was well deserved that she was made to feel special. They were heading toward their home, where their life and their child awaited them. Their world of happiness would be complete with each other's presence and companionship. Suddenly his views about this single female who occupied the space beside him and the place that she now enjoyed by being married to her had taken a 360-degree. The transition from a stranger to being his better half had spanned 20 hours or so, but his feelings for her had changed at a supersonic speed. I guess this is what the sanctity of marriage does. Suddenly two strangers are bound by fate for life, and nature takes its course by developing softer feelings in their hearts to accommodate each other's likes and dislikes, fulfilling each other's wishes, adjusting, staying together through thick and thin, celebrating life and its bounties. After 2 years. It was 2 years today, marking Azan's birthday and their second marriage anniversary. Alian had given Azan his love, and he had grown up to be an adorable child, basking in his attention and care. Someday he would grow into a responsible adult just like his father. Alian. Sahira saw father and son duo together wearing similar clothes. The celebration was over, and they had retired to their bedroom, and the adjacent room, which was a study previously, had been turned into Azan's nursery and play area. They didn't want to send him any farther and away from their watchful eyes. The Shah family were besotted with Alian's son. Everyone realized how important his wife and son were to him and were elated to see him settled at last. To them, marriage to Sahira had suited Aliyan, and Azan was the best thing after Sahira to have happened to him. Was it really 2 years since the day Aliyan had set foot in their lives and creating a heaven for them? He had been the most awesome father to Azan and had treated Sahira with such care and adoration that she felt at times that she is fragile as crystals. She had never foreseen a future like the one she had lived and was more than grateful to her Creator for filling her life with Aliyan and Azan and their love and togetherness. She didn't want for anything anymore, except for their health, happiness, and togetherness. She had been frightened in the beginning of what she would do alone raising Azan while she sat alone on the bench that fateful night when Azan was born, and both her sister and her husband had left their child in her care. She had desperately wished for a miracle so that she could trade her life and return the child his parents. In exchange, the miracle did take place, but the outcome was different. Her Creator had disposed her wishes as He had plans of His own. The child was surely blessed with both parents to love and protect him from the harshness of the world in the form of his aunt and uncle. They had become his parents and nurtured high with love and devotion. Sahira had never regretted once in deciding to be married to Aliyan and providing Azan the family base he needed more than anything. Sahira had found Aliyan to be the best man that walked on this earth. He had never forced his attentions on her. He had become her best friend and confidant in the past 2 years being married to him. She didn't know what she might have done without him in her life. She had settled Azan to sleep in his nursery and had returned to her bedroom where Aliyan was lounging on the bed with his laptop. All his attentions focused on it. For some reason, Sahira felt hurt. She wanted his attention and wanted to talk about the evening where everything was planned to perfection by her husband, and she wanted to praise him, but he seemed to be so occupied, so she silently walked to her side of the bed and, switching off the bedside lamp, lay on the bed with her back towards him. Aliyan looked at her and saw that she hadn't spoken to him once and had turned in for the night. He shut his laptop, placing on the bedside table. Turning toward her, he snaked his arms towards his wife. She was extremely surprised by Aliyan's approach. He never did get physical with her, then how come this sudden change? Aliyan's disturbingly intent dark stare made her breath catch in her throat. Something deep inside her whispered to her that Aliyan was different tonight. He cupped her face and Sahira connected with smoldering eyes that made her heartbeat hammer. He was beautiful and he was hers. She just loved looking at him, and then he kissed her with a sensuality with that beautiful mouth of his, and her ability to think fell away. There were no barriers between them today as Aliyan had seen to them. As he began to lick and kiss his way down over her body, her hands dug into his shoulders. It proved to be challenging to breathe for Sahira. She could never imagine her husband being so sensual all the time she had been with him. He had himself back, and for someone who has never witnessed him out of control was sending her beyond control. She tried to urge him back up again, but today he was a different person altogether. He failed to take the hint and continued to rattle her senses. Aliyan, Sahira muttered, breathless. You make me wild. Aliyan panted. He was lost in her, and slow-burning pleasure turned to raw ecstasy. She went wild, gasping and rising off the bed as an explosive peak engulfed her. Dazed by it, she felt limp as he shifted over her and sank into her depths, hard and fast. Her cry was lost in a smoldering kiss which wiped all thoughts from her mind, and she could feel was him joined as one entity. Nothing had ever felt as intense, and nothing more earth-shattering had she ever faced. She was in heaven as her body had discovered a new level of sensitivity, and in its already heightened state, his rapid powerful movements swiftly awakened the throbbing heat and hunger of need again. Where did he end and where did she begin? Neither of them could tell. Her every sense was heightened with unknown excitement was clawing at her. Her fingers raked down his back over his flexing muscles as she reacted to him, his closeness, his oneness. Pleasurable sensations were tormenting her, wanting more, wanting him. Her back arched and they both reached the glorious splintering high peak of blinding pleasure together. Afterwards a sigh wrenched from her soul and Elian could feel her contentment in his bones. She was finally his in every sense of the word. He husked in her ears. I'm sorry, I was rough, you were like fire in my blood. Sahira kissed him silent, and the words fell away, both arms wrapped round him, happiness dancing and leaping through her veins. She felt loved, every cell in her body was singing. She didn't mind him letting go his reserve around her. You're my destiny and we are bound by endless love, Elian said thickly. He looked intense. She was drowning in his stunning eyes as he bent down and dropped a kiss on her forehead. He pulled her close and she could hear his heartbeat beating in excitement. Elian looked at her wide eyes filled with astonishment and smiled, that devastating smile of his which had the capacity to melt her bones. Time seemed to drag. Her mind whispered to her if she was dreaming then it was the most beautiful one she had had in her whole life, but the aches and soreness in her most intimate core said otherwise, that it was more than real, just like her husband she loved to bits. This was not the friendly Elian she had known within the confines of their bedroom for past 2 years. This was her husband who had gone wild in her arms and took her with him to heaven and back. She would never have believed that he capable of such fiery passion. He bent closer and kissed her some more, and her brain registered only him, all thoughts evaporating. He placed his forehead against Sahira's and asked in a thickened voice, I have patiently waited for you to grow up and give you the time that you needed to accept me in our relationship. My intention was never to force myself on a teenage girl, but now you're 21 years old. You have been with my wife for 2 years and have known me. Tell me, do you trust me enough to spend the rest of your life with me as my wife and mother to my children? Elian lifted his head away from hers, watching her and waiting for her response. He had a stillness over him while he waited for those few milliseconds before he heard Sahira speak in a daze. Elian, I have been very fortunate in finding you as my husband. Never has a day gone by when I have not thanked the Almighty for His mercies towards me and Azan. We have been blessed since you came into our lives. Her voice was tremulous, after all the passion. He wiped the tears away from her face and trailed his fingers down towards her smiling mouth. I always want to see you smile with uninhibited happiness but never cry. Sahira couldn't help but fall deeply, madly, and passionately in love with her husband. She closed the distance between them and kissed him on his chest, her heart swelling with love and respect for the man he was. Unfortunately, he was her man to love and cherish forever. Take me to paradise, Elian. I want to see the stars again. She sounded breathless and wild for her husband, and Elian proceeded to do just that, sealing her smile with his forever. The end. Thanks for watching, friends. Do subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for receiving updates for all our new stories.